Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Probably at the Library. I'm so excited to have you here today. If you're watching with us live or if you're catching this later, really appreciate you spending the time with us here today. Today we have Barbara Heller with us. I am so excited to talk to you, Barbara. I first saw your book at the JASNA virtual conference last year and just fell in love with it, knew I had to have it, and ordered it. And it's been on my bookcase here ever since. And I just love looking at it. It's kind of the highlight here of the room. For any of you that have not seen this book yet, so what Barbara did is she wrote the letters that are included in Pride and Prejudice. You can pull them out as you're reading, and it's more than a book. It's totally an experience in itself to be able to read it and hold on to all the letters. So thank you, Barbara.
Thank you for having me, Melissa.
I am really excited to have you. So let's start out talking a little bit about your introduction to Austen. I laughed out loud when I was reading the introduction, and you referred to it as moralizing slog when you saw it on your sister's bookcase. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was probably a Penguin edition, I'm guessing. And it had, the title Pride and Prejudice. It just sounded like a sermon. And I think there was a portrait of a woman on the cover looking sort of dour and, old-fashioned. And I was 13 and I liked those scholastic paperbacks with, about girls having angsty issues, and there were photographs on the cover. And so I had no desire to read it at all. But I really idealized and idolized my oldest sister, and she pushed it on me. And I was just shocked. It was, for one thing, I'm one of 4 girls, not 5.
Okay.
I really related to that.
Yeah.
And I grew up in the South, which, has a lot of similar manners, etiquette, protocol, similar to England at the time period.
Right.
And I just wasn't expecting the humor, the marriage plot, and I just loved it. And that was the beginning of reading all of Austen, and multiple times at different points of my life, and always responding to it differently, depending on what was going on with me, finding new things, which I still do. And the genius always strikes me anew every time I reread.
So did you quickly read the other Austen, or was it kind of over time?
It was over time. Yeah. I mean, I certainly, now I love Mansfield Park. I certainly didn't when I was a teenager. I just found Fanny sort of a drip. And I used to really be upset that Emma ended up with this old guy. So, but all of that is altered.
Yeah, it's so much fun, as you say, that we each relate to characters so differently and at different times in our life. And you and I were talking a little bit the other day about, the more we learn about the time periods too, kind of opens our eyes up to these aspects that we didn't understand before, which is a part of, I think, what your book offers to readers too, is like that little glimpse into something tangible. And then it gives you so much more to research, the Postal Service and all those things that we'll talk about later. And it makes the book fresh every time that you read it.
I doing all that research about the Postal Service and how letters were sent, it did, as a result, I did experience, parts of the novel in a different way once you have that additional context from the time period.
Awesome. So you also talk a little bit about how Austen's books bring you solace, wisdom, and a reset of your moral compass, which I found to be a really interesting take, because we kind of think of it for comfort, but that's a great perspective, especially as we go through life and we are living different experiences, and how would these characters handle it, because we definitely have, these are the rakes of the book and that sort of thing. And then we have these moral middle ground characters almost. In our last talk, we in my last chat, we talked about Mr. Bennet, and it's so funny how polarizing these secondary characters that she creates are. Whereas, we have some people that just adore Mr. Bennet, and then other people that feel like he was shirking his duties. And it really gives you that, like, you can find yourself, I feel like, in some character in some way and see how did they react to their circumstances. So is there anyone that you specifically have related to throughout reading?
That's interesting. I always admire the fact that Elizabeth stays true to herself, even when potentially she's really blown it with Darcy, because he hasn't yet reformed. She never, even after she gets that letter of explanation and she realizes that she's misjudged and been biased and prejudiced, and until this moment she never knew herself, she doesn't regret turning him down, even though in that day and age, I mean, she's from this penniless family, and he's, wealthy and has standing, and so I admire her for really holding on to the fact that he's, no matter what, he still treated her badly, and he's arrogant. But and Emma too, I admire how Emma blunders and self-corrects, and I think all these heroines have a lot of self-respect. And I think at certain times in my life that has really resonated with me.
I love that. Yeah, you talked about when you were reading that you realized that you said the emotional truths remain the same. And that really struck with me when you said that, because, I review a lot of historical romance, and that's an aspect, of that a lot of people like to romanticize Austen books a little bit more than they are for the movie adaptations and that sort of thing. But there's really strong connection to those characters staying true to themselves.
Yes. I'm sort of lost there. You know what? Will you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. So just, you said the emotional truths remain the same. So
okay. So yes, no, I think that's true. I think that the dilemmas that the characters experience, and how they experience the world and the conflicts that they encounter, it's not related to whether or not there are telephones or cars or airplanes. I mean, how you navigate the world and see yourself, was the same 200 years ago as it is now. Those external trappings really don't matter. And I think that's, a large part, of course, of why these books really remain vital and fascinating to us today, because they explore so many of the same emotional and psychological conundrums that will always be with us.
That's so true. So what sort of gave you that spark? Because you had reread Austen, what made you have that moment where I need to have these letters?
I was reading Pride and Prejudice for, the millionth time. And I love Mrs. Gardner's letter to Elizabeth. And it wasn't a letter I liked, when I read it as a teenager. I kind of found it boring. But now I think Mrs. Gardner's a wonderful writer. And this is the letter that really makes Elizabeth realize that she could have a future with Darcy. And the appreciation that Mrs. Gardner has for Darcy, and you understand that Darcy has learned to appreciate the Gardners. A real relationship and friendship has developed there. You can see them sitting at the table, having a meal, and enjoying each other. And I find that incredibly satisfying, those three characters together. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to hold that letter that Elizabeth held, to have that very letter in my hands? And that was the spark. And then I went through, because I thought, boy, it would be nice to have all the letters.
Mm.
So I went through a digital version of the book, and I did a cut and paste of all the letters into a file. And I was surprised at how many there were. Even having read the book so many times,
Yeah.
there were 20 that were fairly complete. I cut out one from Jane that was very short and very similar to another letter she wrote. And then I looked on the internet to see if anyone else had ever thought to create them, and I couldn't find anything. So that was the beginning of like a 3-year journey of really from idea to finished book, when all was said and done. It took a long time. I had to do a lot of research. I had to, which we can talk more about, but I also had to then create some of the letters to make a proposal. And, it's a long process.
Yeah, I was, for anyone that grabs this book, make sure you read the introduction, because it really gives a lot of insight into your thought process and how you were working on the book. And please do not take offense to this. I think we kind of think like, oh, the book is already there. This might not have been so much work to put together. But as I was reading your process, so you took the text, you did reference work to older letters and to find out the style and the handwriting of the time. And then you had to go and hire people to put these letters together. So by the Scribe Society, or I forget what the exact title
was. Yeah, the New York Society of Scribes. That's where it turned out a lot of the calligraphers were members there.
And then the Postal Service also after that even. So this was like a long labor of love.
I know. I thought the same thing. They're already written. But which in some cases turned out not to be completely true, in that some of the letters she paraphrases part of the letter before she quotes it directly.
Right.
So I had to turn the paraphrase back into letter text, which really, that wasn't that hard because it's there.
Right.
But in other cases, she sort of summarizes, and that felt really like, oh my God, I'm adding words to Pride and Prejudice. And it was very hard to do, to really make sure it integrated into the letter as it existed. So Mr. Collins telling Mr. Bennet that Charlotte is expecting a child, that's summarized. He uses the expression an olive branch, but you don't know if that's Mr. Collins or Mr. Bennet really saying that. But so turning that into Mr. Collins's writing at the conclusion of the letter. And I had 2 of my sisters and a good friend who's an English literature teacher. I mean, we all really worked on that. And same with the paragraph when Jane writes her letter saying that Lydia has eloped. Austen paraphrases, the first part of the letter was about, whatever they've been doing that weekend and goings on. And then she directly quotes it. So I did have to have a few lines there too. And some of them were from Austen's letters, and some were my sister Karen helped create, about the Gardner children. That all felt like, oh my God, I felt doing Austen sacred. So it really, I felt very anxious.
I laughed so loud I scared my cat at the part where your first thought was to make it look like spilled ink across the top of the page when you had to fill in for Austen. I just love that part. I'm glad you did not stick with that solution.
Yeah. I also thought maybe for some of the letters, if they'd really been like old and pass it down, I should have like a coffee ring, like on Mr. Collins, like maybe the Bennets had left it out and there was like a tea stain from a saucer from tea, or or maybe later, generations later, someone had written a phone number in pencil, but I decided it was too gimmicky.
I love the way you did them, so I can't imagine them any other way than the gorgeous way that they are. So I want to talk about letters in general for a second, and then we could jump into some pictures that you have to share about the actual research that you did and the letters that are in the book. So you talk a little bit in the introduction about let's see, how did you, I wrote down because it was so good here. I think I wrote it. That the letters are showing that there is a thought of a person that was held in someone's mind at one time. And that, we've lost that art of holding on to a piece of paper. And like we see Elizabeth rereading the letter from Darcy multiple times and changing in her opinion. Did you have a connection to letters previously, or was it just the letters from the book that made you want to do this?
That's interesting. I mean, I certainly have saved every letter I've ever received, from, letters that my parents and sisters and friends sent me at summer camp, college letters, everything. And I think I imagined that old age would be about sitting down and reviewing all those letters. And I did go through a bunch of them out of curiosity. And sadly, some of them I have no idea who the people are anymore. And some of them, make you uncomfortable, and some make you happy. And it's a whole range of emotions. But I do think that it does represent the time and effort that someone, takes, that they're thinking of you, and they sit down and they take the time to put their thoughts onto paper and mail it and send it. And it's very satisfying to receive a letter, or even a party invitation. It's that connection that I think is very buoying to one's spirits, to have that, to feel that you matter. I think letters are a part of that.
There's a definite disconnect, because by the time my husband and I met, we corresponded over email, for all of our letters to each other. And the other day, before we were moving, I was cleaning something out, and I found my grandmother used to write to me all the time when I was in college away at school, and she passed away. And my grandfather wrote me a letter, saying, oh, your grandmother had much better penmanship, and, just a little scrawl on a note card that he sent to me that I still had. And I just couldn't stop crying when I found this letter.
Wow.
And that seeing their handwriting is just such a way to make that person still feel alive to you and feel special in your memories. We're so used to just plain old typed text anymore, but that connection, which made it such an important part of this book for you to find people to write with the handwriting that came across to the characters, which was fascinating part of this process that I had not thought about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the handwriting is what gives you such an emotional jolt. And I think we all read into handwriting certain personality traits too, whether it's very neat and all the lines are well spaced, or messy. And Jane Austen talks about that. Bingley is, precipitate and hasty, and his letters reflect that. They're filled with blots, and you can't read half the words. Whereas Darcy's writing, is very even and neat. And so that link between handwriting and personality is certainly I didn't feel like I was imposing that on to the novel or the characters. So I needed to find out what letters looked like in 1812, written in England. And the New York Public Library and the Morgan Library in New York both have collections of letters from that time, and were both very welcoming. And I was really surprised when I saw them. I had imagined, sort of wedding calligraphy type handwriting. I thought maybe everyone would have the same penmanship. I thought all the paper would be thick and creamy. I think it's probably from seeing period movies, when in fact, the handwriting was all over the place. It was like you would imagine, just today. Every hand was different, and some were very messy, and some were tiny, and some were large, and some were scrawled, and some were meticulous. And that was a huge relief, because I really wanted the character to come through in the handwriting, and it would have been much harder to do had there been some cookie cutter quality to it.
So I'm going to add to the stream here.
So that is a letter that I found at the Morgan Library, and written in 1812. And I had been really struggling with Jane Bennet's handwriting because I knew that it would be very pretty and even and neat. But I wanted it to still convey something and not just be sort of penmanship like you would expect in a penmanship book. And when I saw that note, I just thought it was so Jane. And it's also, if I don't think you can read it there, but it's also a thank you note. So, a very heartfelt thank you note. And that also, the content too felt right for Jane. And the scribe, Chevalier Sui, she did a, that was the only reference I could find, the only letter in that hand. And she really did a wonderful job capturing that.
This is like casting a movie of characters that you did here for the writing.
It is. It was very much like casting a movie or a play. And I wanted all the handwriting to be different from each other too. So that's how the letters come, folded like that. And it took me a long time to find out what all these numbers and crossouts on the back meant. And I think there's one slide where I annotated an address panel too, and I can explain it.
Let me see here. If everyone will please, oops, nope, I went too far. Bear with my screen sharing skills here. Let me get back.
I know screen sharing is hard.
It is. It's a skill.
But so they did have envelopes, and that's why. So you can even see this letter where it's folded, and they would fold the letter up and write the address on the back. So that is Darcy. Well,
I can go back.
Oh, you know what? You want to show that one because that is, or you want to go back?
I'll go. This one is
that
fine.
one. That one is. That's the letter that the scribe wrote using the handwriting on the sample from the Morgan. So. And as I said, I think she really captured that. I think it's got that sweetness, the sweetness of Jane.
It's very got the curves to the end of the letters. Very sweet.
That's Jane's letter when she's sick at Netherfield.
Let me go to
that's Caroline Bingley's letter.
I'll go to the beginning, I think is the one that you were. One more here. Let me see. Is this the one we were talking about?
Yeah, well, if you want to talk about how the letters were sent, this is a good example.
Perfect.
So you can see that's a letter. The letters were written on a sheet of paper that was folded in half like a greeting card. And you can see this is Mr. Bennet's letter to Mr. Collins at the end. And a letter I love where he says to stand by the nephew, he has more to give. But right on that first page after you fold it in half, and then if you had more to say, this is a short note, you would write on sides 2 and sides 3. Then side 4 with the address, you would fold the letter up and just leave that middle rectangle exposed. They called the address the direction, and it is so it originated in Meryton, and so it has a stamp that says Meryton. The inn would have been the post office, and it is, we know it's under 25 miles to London. So every letter went through London, pretty much every letter, even no matter where it was going. So it was under 25 miles to London, so that cost 6p, also known as 6d. So the innkeeper wrote a 6 on it.
Okay.
It got to London, it got the date and time stamp, and that would have just been 2 days later, saying when it arrived in London. Then the clerk in London would see that it was going on to Hunsford, and that's another 25 miles, which we know from Elizabeth's conversation with Darcy that Charlotte lives less than 50 miles from home.
Right.
So those additional miles add another 1p to the price. Under 50 costs 7p. So the clerk would scratch out the 6 and write the new rate 7. And that's what Mr. Collins would have paid when he received the letter, 7p. The recipient paid the postage, not the sender. And that's why letters were often written, filling up every little piece of the paper and writing small and sometimes crossing. because a second sheet doubled the price. And 7 pence was already a fair amount of money at the time. It was expensive.
I think here we have the next picture. It gives an example of.
Yeah, that's from the New York Public Library. That is an example of a letter with a cross writing. It's so crazy. And there's a reference in Emma. Miss Bates says that Jane Fairfax normally, writes a full letter and crosses half.
Right.
So you would write all your lines, then turn the paper and write the next one's perpendicular.
That is crazy. It's so, yeah. I can't imagine trying to read one.
Yeah, I can't either.
It just looks like, it makes my eyes want to hurt looking at the page.
Yeah, it really looks impenetrable. And sometimes people didn't do it right on the diagonal a third time.
Oh my goodness. So it really was all about economizing as much as possible, because as you're saying, like, letter, the person on the other end is paying for this letter. It's an expensive process to send one at this time. And also, if you could talk a little bit about envelopes of the day or lack thereof.
Yeah, so there were no envelopes. So they would, so you would fold the sheet of paper in half. I mean, some letters were written with the paper vertically, and you see that in my book. But the majority, as in my book, were folded in half like a greeting card. And then they would, fold it in from the sides and then basically into thirds and tuck one flap into another. And then they would seal it with wax. And the wax was both to prevent tampering, but also to show evidence of if it had been tampered with. So there was the wax seal that we all think of. And then they also, which I wasn't aware of, had also a little like gum paste circle that you would wet. You probably licked it. And you would put it between, sort of underneath the top flap and the bottom flap. And you would then stamp it with this sort of waffle seal.
Oh, wow.
Little metal thing, like and that would press it all together. And it's you can tell if the letter has a perfect circle, it was sealed with gum paste for the stamp. Oh, wow. And I did some of that in the book too.
I didn't realize that. So just to kind of show you an example, this is what one of the letters from the book would look like. And as you can see, this one I haven't opened yet. It's folded. So you can do, let me see here.
Yeah, it was figuring out all that folding it was that was hard for me and for Chronicle to figure out how to have it all done. It was they did a great job.
And it's really fascinating to see these large sheets of paper, so different, than we had, where it's opening up into almost a little booklet within itself, and then numbering of the pages.
Paper came in large sheets, and you would cut it yourself. So it would be a large enough sheet that you probably got 4 letters out of it.
Oh, wow. And also for anyone, if you haven't checked out Barbara's Instagram, I'm pretty sure it was on your Instagram, you had a post sharing, it was of all the stamps that you had made so that you could work on the stamps for the letters.
Yeah. So that was, luckily this postal, there are a lot of books, luckily. People collect these old letters for the postal marks. So there are a couple of books that showed all the different postal marks, starting in the early 18th century. And I mean, I had no idea. I mean, when I started, I didn't even know that there were postal stamps used at the time. And we're not talking about paper postage stamps. These are to mark it with the place of origin or a date and time kind of stamp. So a wonderful postal historian named Alan Godfrey really helped me understand the complexities of the postal system at the time. And so I had to have all those, you can see those stamps like with the date and the year. So I had all of those made up, and then with the, like that one says Hunsford and it says the mileage to London, so that the innkeeper would know exactly how many, how much it would cost. That was common too, to have the mileage to London on the origin stamp. So and then the postal rates changed for one letter. So I had to
So
take
the
that into account.
innkeeper was really the postal service then of the time.
Yes, the inns, because that's where the horses were.
Okay.
So the mail coaches would change horses at the inns. So it was natural for the innkeeper to become the postmaster of the town. And then he also made money selling the seats, the passenger seats on the mail coach.
Wow, that's
So that was
fascinating.
he got to keep that income. And people liked traveling by coach, mail coach in some ways, because there was an armed guard standing on the back. So because mail coaches had often been robbed, and they really kept to a pretty strict time schedule so that people could rely on the mail. It was important that they stay on schedule.
That's fascinating. I really didn't think of the inns. Like, I feel like in books you read so many times about them like giving a letter to the innkeeper, but I wasn't thinking like they're actually handling, how far it is to send this letter back and what it's going to cost and all these extra little bits to it.
Yeah, I had always imagined that when Elizabeth wrote Mrs. Gardiner to find out, after Lydia lets it drop that Mr. Darcy had been at the wedding, and Elizabeth writes Mrs. Gardiner to find out, I just always imagined it was weeks before she could have heard, when in fact it would have just been a few days.
Yeah.
Meryton is not far from London. It's just 25 miles. It just would have been, probably 3 days.
I think it's faster than the postal system right now.
Yeah.
Before we get too far in, and we can go to the next slide here. Let me see where we are at. I think, and there's another example of how the letters are folded then within the book. Let me see. We have Caroline. I think
that's Caroline's letter to.
I will go back.
Okay. Well, so that's Caroline's letter. That's the first letter in the book, inviting Jane to lunch. So I knew that Caroline's letter and Jane's letter would be on the same stationery because Jane would have borrowed it from Caroline Bingley. And the letters were sort of similar in length. So I just really wanted to contrast their personalities and their handwriting. So Caroline's is very affected, lots of curly cues on her letters. It's very sort of self-conscious and fancy and a little pretentious. Whereas Jane's is much more genuine and authentic.
And do we have, is there a letter written by Elizabeth in here?
Yes.
Yes.
I think so.
It's
Jane. I included her last letter to Mrs. Gardiner. That's Darcy.
Why don't we stop and talk about Darcy? Because that was what I was going to bring up. So this was something that was a new revelation to me once I got into learning more about Regency era. The fact that unmarried people could not send letters to each other, and how scandalous that truly would have been. So for Darcy to get this letter to Elizabeth without anyone else knowing about it was actually kind of a huge risk on his part, and shows how important it was that he wanted to clear his name. So I'm sure you know more about it if you want to talk about the etiquette of letters.
I was fascinated by that too. No, I didn't know that until I did the research, that at the time, unmarried people could not correspond. And you see it in Sense and Sensibility. When Eleanor sees Marianne writing to Willoughby, she's like, oh, they are engaged, because otherwise Marianne wouldn't be writing to her. So she doesn't understand why Marianne's keeping it a secret, but if they're writing, that means it's fine.
Yeah.
So Darcy had to deliver the letter by hand. Otherwise, it would have given rise to a lot of rumors. And also she then didn't have to write him back. So Darcy's handwriting, I really thought that was going to be a tough one. But in fact, in my research early on at the Morgan, I found letters by the prince who turned out to be the father of Queen Victoria, the Duke of Kent. That's who he was. And he... and honestly, I don't know if the handwriting was his or his secretary's, but it was just so it was so Darcy. So, Barry Morantz, who wrote Darcy here, did a really wonderful job, I think, capturing that essence and also capturing sort of Darcy's changing emotions in the writing and maybe getting a little tired sometimes. And it's it's a really long letter. Barry wrote it over multiple days. But
that was one of the things I was really surprised at when you open it up and you hold it, how many pages of writing there is. Is it not 8, 9 pages? I forget.
Yeah, I think that's the well, I think it's 12 sides.
Yes, I was just going to say 9
pages, and each page has 4 sides.
Yes.
So
yeah, it's
12 sides. So that's I think the 9th page and the 12th page. So you can see how it was addressed to her on the back. And then it's really long.
Yeah.
I mean, in reality, would he have maybe written it smaller? But I wanted to make sure it was legible. I mean, I don't know. It's the same size as the reference, actually. So
okay.
That's how it's the same size as that.
And then,
so that's a big, thick one. Those are the wax stains. The red marks.
Oh,
so that's the reference again for Jane's writing.
Did I go past the Elizabeth letter, or just there?
Huh.
There we go. Nope.
No.
That's Jane's. Thank you guys for your patience. As you can tell, this must be a skill to itself when people do.
I'm so glad you're doing this and not me, Melissa, because I know it's tricky.
Nope, that's too far. Okay, we have to go back. So you can talk, if you want to talk about, while I'm clicking through here to find your inspiration for Elizabeth's handwriting.
Yes, so that was I would look at all these research letters from the time, and I would isolate the letters where I felt the handwriting had character. And then I would sort of go into a trance. That's Mr. Collins's handwriting, which I think is a great mixture of sort of the pompous and
Well, I will leave it on Mr. Collins for now, so I don't make people dizzy going back and forth. And I will take.
I think so. So for Mr. Collins, there was not one reference that I found that was like, oh, this is Mr. Collins. I mean, I found a few things that I really liked, but the scribe really, was familiar with Pride and Prejudice, and we talked a lot about, that his writing would be sort of cramped, and maybe he would also be kind of pretentious, but probably wasn't that well educated. And I think he really got that sort of cramped pomposity in the writing. I could always tell, I could always feel it when the handwriting, when the scribe and the character came together. It was like a performance, like acting, when you can always, when it's right.
Did you?
So I would find handwriting in these reference letters that seemed right for the character, or that just seemed like it had character, and then I would sort of meditate on it and go through all the characters. And sometimes there was great handwriting, but it wasn't right for anyone. But for Elizabeth Bennet, which I really felt it was so important to get that right. Like, what is it about handwriting that conveys wit and intelligence? Like, what are the attributes to handwriting? And that's a really tricky one. The comic characters are obviously a lot easier.
Right.
And I was at the Morgan Library, and I was just really agonizing over this. And the Morgan happens to hold the largest collection of letters written by Jane Austen. And I was thinking about how exhilarating it was to be sort of figuring out the handwriting of her characters under the same roof as all these letters she had written. And I thought, oh my God, of course, Elizabeth Bennet should have Jane Austen's handwriting. So Anna Pinto, the scribe, put together references, and she really spent time, tracing them and analyzing them, and really, I think, beautifully captured Jane Austen's hand in Elizabeth Bennet's. And I really like that resonance between those, the character and the author there.
Yeah, it just seems like, I'm sure it took a while to come to that conclusion, but once you say it, it just seems so obvious. Like, of course, Elizabeth should have Jane's handwriting. It just goes together.
Yeah, I think so too. So that was very satisfying.
So what emotions did you feel when you saw the first copy of your special edition come together?
It was relief, a huge amount of relief, and I think it was wonderful and shocking and kind of numb. I think I felt the same way when I saw my newborn son. It's just, you can't quite take it all in, and so I think but it's been very satisfying, and really that people have, my goal was to create a connection to the novel, a different way to connect to the novel, a different way to experience it. And from the feedback I've gotten, it seems to that seems to have come across, and that makes me really. And you can tell from the introduction, I mean, I love doing it. I loved everything I learned. I loved being steeped in Austen. I've met so many people who share that reverence for Austen and were excited by the project and talking about her characters and her life. And I mean, it was wonderful, and continues to be. Look, I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The uniqueness of it is it makes you feel like, Mrs. Gardner might be moving into the house next door. Like, these are real. You just feel like they're real people now rather than characters in a book, because it really changes the way you feel about them with this tangible item that was from them, that you created.
Well, thank you very much.
You are welcome.
Yeah, it's been very nice.
Your next project is Little Women. That's going to be coming out, I believe, in the summer, right?
Yeah, it's coming out in August. So it was nice to put all of my hard-won lessons to good use. And it's 60 years later, and it's amazing how much paper, the choices of paper have really advanced. So for Pride and Prejudice, it was really just, is the paper white, off-white, kind of brownish, and then there's textures. But by the 1860s, the Civil War, they had blue paper, they had blue ink, people wrote in pencil, they had real stationery, monograms and hotel stationery, they had patriotic Civil War stationery. So it was really, it was fun to get to have those other elements as new ways to tell the story and convey character.
It's going to be so much fun to see that book also come alive. So I will wrap it up, because you've generously given us so much of your time and shared so much about this wonderful book. We had a few comments that I was going to share here on the screen. Okay. So, and to thank people for being with us. So thank you, Darcy. I'm glad you were able to join us, and that you found it as interesting as I do, and that Barbara enjoyed the process too. Hi, just wanted to tell you what a wonderful idea was to have the letters actually written. And Darcy's hand is quite what I imagined also. Absolutely great book. Oh, that's so
that is so nice to hear. I just, I really sweated every decision. So it's just really gratifying to hear that. It's really nice.
And then thank you, Doya, for stopping in. I'm glad you had fun watching this. And then Melissa says, yes, that is so true. That was such a unique aspect. I was telling my dad this the other day about, people paying when the letter was, and he was like, that's such a unique aspect. It really puts a new perspective on sending someone a letter. in the Regency area and being conscious of if they could afford the letter, if they could, send you the response back.
Yeah. Jane Austen crossed some of her letters too. I mean, not a lot, but sometimes she would do a few lines. And often she would write around the address, using up every little bit of space and handwriting getting smaller and smaller.
I wonder, so this is totally off topic, but my brain sometimes, when did postcards become popular, I wonder? Because
I think postcards were later, but in the 1830s, the Royal Mail completely reformed the postal system, and they brought in the adhesive postage stamp and uniform penny postage. So it became, and then the senders paid, bought the stamp. It was much cheaper.
Okay.
And part of it was that franking, which was, how members of parliament could send letters for free, had been really abused because postage was so expensive. Everybody tried to send their letters, franked. So it was partially to get rid of that corruption.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, thank you, Barbara.
Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. I really enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure to talk to you. It's the same as we talk about rereading Austen. When I get to talk to the person behind the book, it just makes me enjoy the book that much more because I learned about your research, and knowing how much you enjoyed putting it together makes it so much fun to read. So I added
part of the fun. So thank you.
Oh, good. I added some links down below for anyone that is interested in grabbing the book. It is, there's a sale, so I added the coupon code for that down below, and it's also marked down on Amazon right now too for the same price as the coupon code. If you're impatient and you need it at your doorstep with Prime, you can grab it there. Make sure you check out Barbara. You're on Instagram and Facebook. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I don't post that often, but I try.
Yeah, and your website also shares some really interesting tidbits about the book. I believe I included a link to that also, and you can see some of the faces behind the writers.
Yeah, you can read more about the scribes, and there's a link to an article in the Smithsonian where they show, they have a great interactive graphic explaining the postage.
Oh, that's awesome.
how it was all sent. So that's fun if you look under press.
I'm sure writers with horribly incorrect scribes, I need to remember to call them their scribes.
Well, calligrapher scribes. Yeah.
Yes, they do beautiful work. It's interesting. I was even looking at some of them have posts on Instagram of the work that they do, which is really fascinating also.
No, they're all really talented.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.
All right,
take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.